This is my first year in partnerships and clinical trials, and I'm very excited to be here. I moved to Asia in October of 2007, and Asia is on the forefront, I think, of many pharmaceutical companies or CROs in terms of gaining access to patients. It is, as stated in the past, you can't think of Asia as a continent. Asia is a region, and a very diverse region. Australia is much more westernized. You have Korea, that their government has spent an enormous amount of money to increase the presence of clinical research in the country. You think of China, and it's now the #2 pharmaceutical market in the world. Think of India. You think of the world's population, it's predominantly based in Asia. So when you talk about change in the clinical research industry, it's just gaining more access to a region that hadn't really had that expertise in the past. When I think of Asia, and when I was sent there very specifically for a former company to really help bring staff up people, train people, increase a presence, and that company alone has quadrupled in the last 7 years. So it is really a very unique region to be in, and one of the reasons I love being there is it's so diverse and it's ever evolving. People are very excited. Doctors are excited to participate in new research. Patients want access to new medicines. Physicians, scientists in Asia want to develop new medicines, and they want to tap into that global expertise. They want to tap into global markets. They want to develop in Asia and bring it to the emerging regions, to the West, to Europe, the US. So it's a very exciting place to be. So when you think of CROs in Asia, there is a very, very diverse group of companies, and it's very exciting. You have some of the very large CROs. You think of a Quintiles, a PPD, a Parexel, a PRA, and I can't list them all. Then you think of some of the regional players. So they will be the experts on the Asia region. Something like a George Clinical, Tiger Med is increasing its expertise in the region. And then you have local players in many countries who their real expertise is in that local environment. Sometimes they cater more to the local clients. But as a global company, depending upon your product and what you hope to achieve in that country that you plan to market your product in, that's how you really decide what is your strategy. Whether you use a global company, whether you use a regional company, or whether you use a local company. I think when you look at the breadth of expertise, some of the large global companies, they have that infrastructure. They have, the local team can really gain expertise, gain knowledge from their global counterparts. They have very global standards that need to be followed. And many of the large global companies have invested in the regions in specific countries. I think when you look at the regional expertise, if your plan is to develop a product that's specific to meet the unmet medical needs of perhaps patients in a region, well, then your strategy may be a little different. It may be you want a regional player. You want someone who can work in China, in Australia, in Korea, the Philippines, Malaysia, India for that sake. And some of the local companies can't do that. They're really the expert in their local country. And if your plan is you're going to do perhaps an older established compound, there's now a need in a market that you'd like to develop the compound in the market, well, it might be a better strategy to work with a local company. They'll have those key relationships with investigators. They'll understand the culture, the people, and they'll be able to dedicate more to you in that particular instance. It really depends on what your strategy is to bring a compound to market. I think with smaller companies that are moving into this new frontier, the Asia region, there are points that could be beneficial to consider. oftentimes a smaller company may not have staff on the ground. They may not have, say, local affiliates or local operating companies who already have relationships with investigators. They may be really counting on some type of vendor service organization, whether it's a CRO, whether it's a manufacturing company, whether it's a commercial, where you're going to hire someone to market your compound who's going to represent you in a particular country. I think there's things that are important to consider, and at least it's things I've seen in my past, having been in Asia for a while, in two different types of organizations, because I've worked in the CRO world, and I've also worked in the pharmaceutical world. I think it's important to ensure that people understand you. And when I say that, it sounds very simple. What I see is things do get lost in translation. So people may say yes, 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 or yes, 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 when they really mean, well, maybe, sure, but I'm going to do it my way anyway. And it's important to develop a really good relationship with a vendor. Depending upon the type of vendor, is it a small vendor? Do you have concerns for quality? Do you not have concerns for quality? Is it a larger vendor? Do you have some form of governance that when you're working with that vendor, you can ensure you're meeting not only your timelines and your cost, but are your patients safe in that environment that you're working with? I think that's one of the biggest things that you need to consider. It's also important, you may have to work with vendors. It's important to understand what is the market. Oftentimes people think Asia, emerging region, large number of patients, my compound's going to do wonderful there. But you want to ensure you've done your research, because what is on the ground there? Is there something that's already on the ground, or is there something that's already been developed that's being marketed in that country? I think we're starting to see in a lot of the emerging regions, you certainly see this in Europe, and many countries in Asia are taking a very similar route from a health authority perspective. You know, in many countries in Asia, the patients are covered under national health care. So governments are applying more scrutiny when they look at compounds. If you're fourth or fifth to the market with your compound, you may not have something that will get on a reimbursement list. So it's important to create those relationships, whether it's through a partner, through a ventureship, through a vendor service of some form, but it's almost do your homework so that you know what you're getting into when you go to the Asia region. When we talk about intellectual property, that's something very important to consider. And I mean, many of us have heard in the news, in the headlines, concerns going into particular countries. I think first and foremost, we have to remember we're all in this for the patient. But for those of us in the pharmaceutical world, we want to ensure that we're investing in what's best for our patients. And it's very hard when particular governments may say, you're not going to have exclusionary rights to this compound. And if you bring it to that particular country, you may not be able to have the rights. And that can be very hard. So it's important, as I had stated before, to consider really what is your strategy when you're going into a particular country. Are you going to go for a new compound? Is this a branded generic? So you may still be competing with generics on the market. However, if your brand, if you have other compounds in that market, your brand may help you as you bring your product into the market. So it's something worth considering. I think when we talk about the regulatory environment in Asia, this is an area that's ever evolving. I'd like to say it's almost evolving on a daily basis. But it is something that's changing. I think some of the emerging regions like the US FDA, the EMA, have had much influence in a lot of the emerging countries. And we're starting to see a lot of change across the Asia region. There's enormous change ongoing in India, and it's going in the right direction. There's a lot of change going on in China as part of the new 5-year plan. There's whole new strategies that are being rolled out to ensure there's more oversight, more of that regulatory oversight. There are concerns in China. There's just not enough staff within the Chinese regulatory authority with a large influx of clinical trials, both from domestic companies as well as multinational companies. So there is change that it's going to continue to evolve, and it's important to stay ahead. Read, do your homework. If you're working with partners, they may know. They have the experts on the ground in these countries. They may be able to give you valuable information as you start to make your plan and your clinical development plan. Well, I think when you talk about selecting CROs in Asia, whether you're a small company, mid-sized company, large company, there's a lot of variables, and I don't think I could cover that today in a full interview. You want to make sure it's a fit. Is it someone you can work with? Especially when you're a smaller company, and I'm going to use an example. You're a small company in the US, and you're working with a local company in China. You want to pick a company that there's going to be someone on the ground who's going to be able to communicate with you. You're going to need to find a way to ensure they understand what you're asking of them. Again, things can be lost in translation. You want to understand, are they really a legal entity in the country? I think that's very, very important to understand. I've seen there's over 500 CROs in China alone. So you want to find what are you going to be most comfortable working with in that country. You're going to be spending, good money. This is all about the patients. You want to bring something safe to the market, and you don't want to finish a trial and then have the regulatory authority say, no, no good, repeat the trial. And we have seen that across multiple countries and multiple companies in Asia. I think the other thing that's important is when you're working with some of these vendors, is there some form of governance? Now, it would be very hard if you're a small company and you're working with many local CROs. If you're working, let's say, in Korea, in China, in India, in Singapore, in Australia, you have to consider your expertise and your resources. How can you manage that? And that's where there's value sometimes in working with either a regional CRO or sometimes with a larger global CRO. If it's a global CRO, you may have staff that can work with your CRO vendor on the ground in your country. So if it's the USA, at least from an expertise, a communication channel, you won't be working odd hours. I joke with my staff all the time. We work very odd hours because we work in a global company, and I have meetings many hours of the day. So you just have to think about what's going to work best for you and for your company. You want to ensure you're going to have a quality product on time within budget. So when you're working with the vendors, you want to ask very specific questions. Because a lot of times they are going to say, yeah, I can do it. Ask them, help me understand, how will you do this? Walk me through the steps. And I know it may sound silly that you have to ask that much detail, but when you're working with smaller companies, or even if you're working with larger companies, you want to make sure you understand one another. If you're working with a large global company, you want to make sure they understand what's going on in the ground in the Asia region, so that the information that they're providing you is really the information that's on the ground in the Asia region. And if you're working with a smaller company that is specific to Asia, whether it be regional or local, you want to make sure you have very good communication lines. And it helps to have face-to-face meetings. And I know in a cost-constraint world that can be difficult. Consider video conferencing if need be with your Asian colleagues or your Asian vendors. Many of them will not have telepresence, even though most of us do. But try to find ways so that when you're talking to them, you also see them often. because that really helps in that communication. Because sometimes you can see if they don't quite understand something, on the phone it may sound like they understand it, but perhaps in a video conference or face-to-face, you can tell they need a little bit more information so they clearly understand what you would like. I remember when I first moved to Asia, someone I reported into said, "You need to go over there and make them do it the US way." And I learned very quickly, it's not possible. You have to think of, when you work in a global environment, we have to respect one another in this global world. And there are certain cultural nuances. It doesn't mean they can't follow ICH-DCP. It just means, even within the US, if you compare someone from New York to somebody from San Francisco to somebody from Texas, we're all different. So when you go to the Asia region, you need to be patient. You need to ensure you understand one another. And there's a respect there. You need to respect them and they will respect you. When I first arrived in Asia, I remember someone saying to me in my first week, "Patrecia, we don't need you. Go back to the US." And my response was, not so much that you need me. I wanted to know you. I want to learn how you do what you do so I can help my team back in the US understand Asia better. We're in this together. Even within our own company, we're in this as a partnership. So whether we work in a partnership, how we work with our sponsors, how we work with our CROs, how we work with our joint ventures, we're in this together. And if we learn from one another and we respect one another, then we'll get the job done, and we'll get it done to the global standards that it needs to be done to. This is my first year in partnerships and clinical trials, and I'm very excited to be here. I am excited to be participating in the Asia almost full day, which I didn't realize. I thought it was only one session, so I'm very excited about that. I think it's great to network, to meet with peers from around the world, to learn from one another. We're all in this for one reason and one reason only. We want to bring new medicines to patients and to meet their needs around the world. And this is why we do what we do. So to be in an environment with my peers, with my colleagues, and really learn from one another is an incredible opportunity. So I'm excited to be here in Nevada for this session in partnerships and clinical trials. And I'm also excited I'll be participating in the partnerships and clinical trials in Shanghai later in this year. So I'm really excited for these opportunities.